Late 80s slashers are so overlooked. If your slasher movie wasn't part of the big franchises like Friday the 13th, Halloween, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, people just didn't care by the late 80s. Heck, audiences even dwindled for those major franchises during this time as well. The slasher boom that started in the early 80s was dying out. Sure, some movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984 helped keep it afloat for a while and regained some interest in the genre, but it was merely on life support. The slasher craze that took over the world, the genre that anyone could do, the genre that just couldn't lose money, was finally dead by the end of the decade. Audiences were just over the craze. Sure, some people still try to make slashers in hope of stumbling upon a revival. I mean, it was low risk, high reward after all, but the genre basically stayed dead until Scream in the mid-90s. So what happened to all the slashers that were made in the late 80s? Well, they went mostly unseen. Hardly anyone talks about them in the same breath as My Bloody Valentine or The Burning, but that doesn't mean that there weren't gems near the end of the decade. And we're gonna cover one of those gems tonight. Rush Week. Originally filmed in 1988 and not officially released until the early 90s, it seemed that distribution companies didn't know what to do with this movie. A theatrical release would have surely lost money, so eventually they settled on TV deals and video rentals. It was basically swept under the rug, but over the years, Rush Week has slowly gained a cult following as more and more people are finally starting to see it. Rush Week is a darn near perfect slasher film. It's stylish, has an engaging story, likable leads, intimidating masked killer, solid cinematography, boobs, and a killer soundtrack. It marks all the boxes off for a memorable and enjoyable slasher, except for the most important box. What's Rush Week missing, you ask? Well, let's find out together. Welcome to the HellBound Horror Show. Rush Week starts by delivering the goods early. We open on a crazy college fraternity party filled with rocking music, bodacious babes, and plenty of disposable teens drinking their weight in beer. The fraternity president, Jeff Jacobs, is a typical 80s love interest who is equally as brooding as he is secretive. He's oddly charming, but he has some of that red herring plastered all over him. We meet Tony Daniels, a new student at the school who has an eye for a good story. Tony is extremely likable, smart, heroic, determined, and a natural leader. She's someone you can easily root for, and dare I say it, she has some of the hallmarks of a great final girl. She wants to be a journalist and attempts to work her way up the ranks of the school newspaper. She wants to write interesting and hard-digging articles, but of course the newspaper would rather focus on Rush Week, a college tradition where pledges of a fraternity get hazed and initiated into the group. I'll be upfront, the whole fraternity thing never appealed to me. I don't think it's the most respectful or inclusive thing in the world, and I couldn't be bothered to remember Alpha, Gamma, whatever it is. But I will say this, I love the whole Greek college thing in horror movies. There's just something about seeing that jerky fraternity guy getting chopped up that's oddly satisfying. Tony isn't a fan of fraternities either and doesn't want to write about them. Instead, she wants to write about some real drama, a real scoop. Well, a real scoop stumbles upon her. A secretive photographer has been hiring co-eds to pose nude for some photos for a mysterious client. There's a handful of these young girls that work for hire for this photographer, and some will even pose with corpses as the mystery client loves this. The pay is good, but the taxes are terrible. There's a mysterious masked killer stalking the girls who work for this photographer. The mask looks great, and the murder weapon is an axe that looks oddly familiar. Oh shoot! Tony catches wind of this story of girls going missing and never returning back to their dorms. Tony wants to write a story about this, but of course, the newspaper editor thinks Rush Week is more important. Tony goes rogue and begins to investigate on her own, which leads her closer to prime suspect number 1, the charming president of the fraternity, who has a dark and mysterious past. The two connect and end up falling in love. Did Tony fall for the killer? Or is the killer the photographer who takes smutty pics of college girls and works in the school cafeteria by day, stalking new talent? Maybe it's the head of the paper, a hippie who loves drugs and sex and wants Tony to ignore the missing girl cases. Maybe it's the dean who says girls go missing all the time and it's not an issue to worry about. It could be the rival fraternity who's tired of being bullied and looked down upon. Maybe it's the creepy guy stalking the girls in the bushes. Heck, it could even be this pledge's father. Wait, no, sorry, that's the wrong movie.
Well, if that's the way you feel, just forget it. But I think you're really out of line.
I love Rush Week and thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. Pamela Ludwig, who plays Tony, and Dean Hamilton, who plays Jeff, are phenomenal in their roles. I was super surprised finding out that they didn't go on to bigger and better things. I was half expecting them to be household names. They were great and both were written well. Tony is a pretty good final girl, although she does become a little helpless near the end of the film, which did weaken her character a bit in my eyes. The story is pretty engaging. I figured out who the killer was about 15 minutes into the movie, and if you're a fan of slashers and know the tropes, it's really obvious, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the movie. Yes, it's a murder mystery, and the film relies heavily on the mystery aspect, but I was still engaged and invested in Tony and her story. It wasn't about me knowing who the killer was, I was more invested in Tony finding out who the killer was. The music is top notch. The opening theme is so darn good. I love when movies like this bring in a few bands. It adds a lot of life to the film, and these songs are all pretty catchy and memorable.
So you try to do your best, cause you know it's the only thing that keeps you going, cause you look like all the rest, so you do it. Yeah, you do it. You need something new, yes you do. You need something new, yes you do.
Lighting is top notch for a slasher. I love the colors, a lot of greens and purples, and it looks fantastic on Vinegar Syndrome's transfer. Cinematography is also solid. Things are framed well, captured well, and the action flows from shot to shot. It's a pretty movie to look at, which isn't always the case with cheap slasher movies. The story is above average. It actively tries to keep things moving, interesting, and engaging. Yes, we know who the killer is, but only because the movie fails to go against slasher tropes. It's very formulaic, but it's done well, and there's a polish and refinement to it. The killer is intimidating. I love the mask and the look, and the double-sided axe is also a great weapon. But this is where we get into the biggest negative. The only real knock on the movie. The reason why Rush Week isn't in the upper echelon of slasher greats. The reason it's still criminally underseen. Rush Week has virtually no gore. Yeah, blood and gore is one of the biggest staples of the slasher genre, and it's nowhere to be seen. And it's not like Final Exam, a movie infamous for its lack of gore. Final Exam at least has violence and clarity on death. Rush Week will set the kill beautifully and then cut before the impact. It feels like it was cut for TV or butchered by the MPAA, but no, this is just how Rush Week is. There is one notable death near the end, but that's it. And there's not even a high body count either. Now, I don't need Tom Savini levels of blood and guts in my slasher movies. I love a lot of films that skimp on the gooey red stuff, but the lack of kills and the lack of gore really does hurt Rush Week. Unfortunately, you need some slashing in a slasher movie. Does the lack of gore completely soil Rush Week? I don't think so. Sure, it lessens the experience, but everything else here is top notch and totally worth checking out. If you're a fan of Final Exam, Hell Night, and Graduation Day, I think Rush Week will be a pleasant surprise. It has elements from great college comedies like Animal House, but also elements from great slashers as well. It's an enjoyable horror movie that's entertaining from start to finish, and it mostly scratches that slasher itch. Rush Week is a late 80s slasher that's actually worth checking out. That's all I have for tonight. So, thank you so much for watching, and stay spooky, everyone.